Great. Well, thanks everyone for coming. This sort of grew out of a research project that Chris and myself were working on here at Stephen Winter Associates into energy storage. And we've sort of, the idea is we've got Doug from Demand Energy, Josh from Glenwood, and then the two of us from Stephen Winter. Sort of give you an overview of the way the system works, energy storage, sort of technical stuff, and an owner's perspective, and then sort of a technical side is how do you determine if a building's a good fit and screen a portfolio of buildings. So the idea is to sort of go through the presentations. If you have a very specific question, I think we're happy to address it then. But then we wanted to save sort of an hour at the end for a open discussion, sort of questions, feedback, things that you're seeing or want to know more about. So if you have sort of more general, broad questions, maybe hold them to later in the session, if that's good with everyone. And yeah.
Get started.
Let's get started.
Yeah. We're going to feed you with a fire hose information on the front end here. So if anything seems confusing or you need clarification, just please speak up. We'll take you through. But I'm Doug Staker, Vice President of Sales for Demand Energy. We specialize in behind-the-meter energy storage. We've been here in the city working with Glenwood since 2010. And we've installed a little over a megawatt, 4 megawatt hours of systems and buildings that Glenwood manages. We've got multiple other projects going with Glenwood, and we're building a microgrid with L&M out at the Marcus Garvey project out in Brooklyn, Queens. So talk a little bit about, storage. And so, fundamentally, I always like to start and think about, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And this is a profile of the electricity usage in New York State last Friday. And nothing is particular about last Friday other than what I try to, inform everybody and let everybody understand is that every day in New York State, there's a peak that occurs, and typically it's about a 4-hour peak. It shifts around, changes a little bit in magnitude and also a little bit in duration. But the point being is that the grid is the perfect just-in-time inventory system. So there's generation that has to engage and disengage for that peak period. And that generation is usually more expensive generation, peaking power, plus the fact that you're moving energy through the supply system at peak where you have the highest losses. And so the paradigm of continuing to build to meet the peak is we could continue to do that, but that's a little bit about what the REV initiative is starting to look at is how do you transform the energy supply system to where we can leverage a lot of idle capacity at night, which is in the trough of that diagram. There is the low, and maybe move energy through the system when line losses are lowest, when in the transmission system, distribution system, and just how do we more or better manage the energy supply chain? And from my view, that's really the problem we're trying to solve here. So, and this is really the story of the city here. If you think about Manhattan, or not Manhattan, Con Ed's territory is very interesting in that it is very close to approaching 14 gigawatts at peak. Now, 14 gigawatts sounds, I don't know, relatively benign, but if you think about this, that's a quarter of what the state of California uses at peak. California peaks at 44 gigawatts in the summer. New York City, Con Ed service territory, the city in Westchester County is approaching a quarter of what the state of California uses for energy at peak. And California is no slouch in energy usage, right? It's not like they're the bane of efficiency or whatever. But so when that's why we have these programs like demand response, and we've seen in the past rollouts, grid issues. One of the things that we've learned with Glenwood when we start to look at peak days and you start to see voltage problems start to show up in these buildings, and the first canary in the coal mine there is elevators. The elevator systems start to be problematic. And if you think about why we have energy density in the city that we have, it's because we stack people on top of people, and we use elevators to get people up and down, and then they're the first signal of problems. So it's one of the things that we've looked at with Glenwood, and why is a building owner concerned about grid stability? Because it causes operational issues on days where the grid's challenged. So really looking at how do we stay out of those conditions? Because here's the issue. The top, this is the statewide curve, but the city curve is very similar. The top 1 gigawatt of usage in the city lasts for 36 hours in a year. The top 2 gigawatts last for 156 hours a year. Now, that's not continuous, but if you think about that, if you said there are 9 peaking days in the summer and the peak lasts for 4 hours, that's where the system gets strained and stressed, and it's problematic. The other thing that I'll talk about here in a little bit is the city peaks in different areas at different times of the day. Right here in the Fashion District, this area here, peak usage is from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. Downtown, Financial District, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. Over at Penn Station, it's 11 to 3. As you move up into, as you start to approach the Upper East Side, Upper West Side, more, near Columbus Circle, the lower end there, those peak from 4 to 8 p.m., and then the residential areas peak from 7 to 11 at night. So when you look at how people move through the city, the load just follows it. And being able to be selective and achieve load reduction in different parts of the city is really where we're trying to head. And we'll talk a bit about, what we're trying to do to move forward and get the rate structure to encourage the load reduction when it has the most value. So this is a load graph, a 24-hour load graph of one of Glenwood's buildings. It's called the Paramount Tower. It's over on 39 between 2nd and 3rd. This building has about a 580 kW system peak in the summer. This snapshot was, I think, just the other day I took last week. The blue line is how we make the load look to Con Ed. The green line is the true building load, okay? Now, what's important that we've been able to leverage in these projects is that we've been able to move these accounts onto standby. And when you move an account onto standby rates, your demand is only measured from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. There's a lot of people in the city that believe that standby is, nothing but a demon in disguise. But what we've been able to leverage is because it only measures demand from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., we can do crazy things like load the battery up in the middle of the night. That's what's going on with that big spike. That's us refilling the battery system. And then you'll notice that as the building starts to come to life in the, just have a pointer on it, Chris?
The red button, right? Oh.
So right here, this is about 6 a.m., and you see how the load starts to ramp up. This is the common space load of, what is it, a 400 unit? 465 unit residential building, okay? But it's the common space load, so it's the elevators, all the mechanical systems, all the load there. You can see the load starting to ramp up in the morning. We don't have to engage and start reducing demand until we start at about 7. And then we'll shave that demand throughout the operating day. And this is what the day before, how it looked. So we're able to take advantage of that. And a couple of things is there's a component of the demand bill that is the daily demand charge. So every day we have the opportunity to drive savings for Glenwood. When you look at this and say, how much? So this is what we saved last year. And we use a combination of rates and rate design to drive these savings. First of all, we'll go from a flat rate, which was about 8 cents previous year, to a day-ahead index rate. And the index rate, there's a lot of folks that are nervous about it. Index rate is basically you will pay the price of energy based upon the NYSO day-ahead locational-based marginal pricing. And when we first did this, we did this with the Barclay Tower system that we put in back in 2012. And what we proved to Josh is being on that rate in itself is a savings. But it also allows us to buy energy at night when it's cheaper and then use that energy and get some offset from the system when we inject that energy back into the building. Second part of that is the delivery charges. So you'll see we saved about $50,000 in energy cost reduction last year and about $30,000 on demand charges. Now, what's impressive about that is that these systems were installed under the NYSERDA Con Ed DMP program. And what that means is that in the summer, June through September, we have to do a bulk generate from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. where we run the system at full power and just reduce the load in bulk fashion. We don't follow the building load, we just inject. And that's these little dips you see here in each day. That's the bulk generation mode. And then these spikes here are us loading the batteries, but you see these buildings tend to peak that 8 to 10 in the morning time frame. So we don't really drive any demand savings during the most expensive time period of demand charges in the summer. But what was nice about this program is it paid for about 50% of the capital cost. So when Josh looked at the economics for the project, yeah, we could drive more savings if we did demand charges, but it really helped in reducing the capital cost. Now we'll talk a bit about the new program that they came out with, DMP2. And the reason they formulated that was a little bit, we just pointed out that this was Con Ed's first trial and how to incent, load reduction, and this is using, an old style of bulk load reduction, but we pointed out it's kind of insanity. It doesn't really help your customers drive any savings. It helps them capital costs, but doesn't drive any savings. Some of the new rates and new incentives that are out there will do that. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. So that whole DMP experience taught us that we would really like to try to get the whole path of rate structures to move to more locational and time-based design. And I like to say that, we're trying to build a digital power system while we're using analog rate design. If you think about the way rates are, most standard commercial rates are, you get billed for two components, your energy, your usage for the month, and then your peak demand charge, whatever it was throughout the operating period for the billing period, a 24/7 sort of measurement. And if you had a peak that's at 8 in the morning in a district that peaks from 2 to 6, the value to the grid of reducing that peak is not that beneficial. But you as a building owner would see a reduced bill. So our argument has been, and we've been successful in this thing auto-driving.
Go back to the other one.
Okay. The argument we've made to the Public Service Commission is that if you really want to get load to shift, and if you really want to start to shape the profile, let's use price as a signal. So we've been able to argue for the point that we think that demand charges under standby, that we've moved them to daily charges. We'd like to get them subdivided into hourly charges where it's more expensive in that district peak. And we were able to get a pilot approved for starting in 2018 that will test out that theory. We meet with Con Ed this month to hammer out what the prices are going to be, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I think it's a step forward in doing exactly what Richard Kaufman, the head of NYSERDA and Cuomo's energy guy, has been trying to drive with REV, and what Audrey's been trying to drive from the Public Service Commission is how do we use price as a signal to the market to get load to shape, how to shape load. So in this latest rate case, Con Ed got approved under their ETIP program, what they call the DMP2 incentives. How many people here have looked at the DMP incentives, or maybe you've even applied for some of these? This has been out for a while. Anybody? Okay, so this has energy savings reductions, but for storage, what they put in here is $1,500 a kW. The requirement is you have to do very similar to what we do under DMP1, bulk generation from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m., but it's only on days that they initiate demand response, which is known as the Commercial System Relief Program, or you'll hear the acronym CSRP. So for us, as we do operations under standby, every day we're driving demand charge savings, and they'll give us notification 21 hours ahead of time. We'll know, okay, tomorrow's going to be an event. We'll forego the demand savings for that day, and we'll just operate under the bulk dispatch that they've asked for from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m., and we'll only lose 1 day of demand savings instead of losing the demand charge for the entire month, because if we weren't on standby, the likelihood that we would hit a peak on a CSRP day is really high. So we're going to lose some savings for that 1 day that we don't participate, but then the next day, if they don't call an event, we go right back into demand charge savings. So the thing we like about standby is the operational flexibility it gives us in how we approach the market. These are the Con Ed networks that have the different hours of peaking. You can see, here's all the 11 to 3 segments, the 2 to 6, the 4 to 8, and then all the residential districts here, basically 7 to 11. And so there's issues around, if you look in just Manhattan, you can see, like down here at NYU and Cooper Square area, that's an evening peaking section. So reducing load midday down there, nice. It doesn't really help solve the problem as far as removing the peak of that network. You look at downtown, all the financial district, this is all basically 11 to 3. You go over into Brooklyn, Borough Hall, same thing, where there's a lot of government offices, the trading desks, things like that. You'll see more midday peaking. And then it's kind of a mix in the commercial segment here, these checkered areas here, Chelsea, and we're right here in the Fashion District substation. Those peak from 2 to 6. So what we've been working on is how to get this rate designed. We look at a lot of property. Glenwood owns a lot of property up here in Yorkville. That's what we've heard, one of the next troubled networks that Con Ed's starting to see stress under. And so the concept is, how do we take this new rate design and apply it to those properties in that space? And the concept of this is in the rate case. There's a 25 megawatt pilot that allows you to convert over to this new rate design. It's voluntary. You don't have to do it. We think it's encouraging. And as soon as we get the rate information settled out with Con Ed, we'll be able to run the business cases and show out what the savings would be. But our initial review is it's pretty strong. And so the concept would be it's voluntary. You're only charged from demand, again, just like standby, from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. It's based on block pricing. We had initially proposed hourly pricing. Con Ed has told us that they can't handle hourly pricing. They can handle a block price for a 4-hour period. So we're working with them in this collaboration that we've been directed to do with them through the Public Service Commission. It's valid Monday through Friday. Nights and weekends aren't included. We meet with them this month to get the price set, and then the rate goes into effect the 1st of January in 2018. So that's kind of an overview of what, why, and how we do this with storage. I'll let Josh talk here a little bit about Glenwood's experience, why they looked at storage, how they've intertwined storage into their operation. But before I do that, any questions? Please.
We've had a number of buildings. I'm with Douglas Elliman Property Management that have seen significant rate increases in their adders. We typically use the NYISO day-ahead rates for electricity as well. Due to the peak day that Con Ed chose last year, I think it was early September, which nobody knows in advance and it's hit. How does this system impact that unknown ICAP? Because that can be a significant factor free nights and weekends, and evenings are typically, our highest use for all those buildings. And the maps, although many of them were blue for daytime, there are significant numbers of residential buildings in those areas that might potentially benefit from peak load periods that are different from the actual
building load.
building peak loads.
Right. Okay, couple of things. First of all, your ICAP is, it's a statewide issue. They look at the building and they say, what was your peak during the state system peak, okay? Then that ICAP number is for your energy retailer. When he goes out and buys energy in the wholesale market, he also has to sum up all his customers' ICAP charges and buy that capacity at a set price. So he'll sum that all up, and then typically, there are ways that they'll design a rate where they may include that ICAP charge in your monthly bill, but there are also other rates where, like with Glenwood this year, when we looked at what we got for the adder that they put in, no ICAP, just what their adder was, it went from 3 cents a kilowatt hour down to 2. My suspicion is this year, watching natural gas prices start to go up, that next year, and they negotiate a new supply contract every year, we'll probably see that creep back up. It may go to 2.5 cents from an adder, but different retailers will vary the ICAP charges in different ways. When we first put a system in 2012, the supplier that was supplying Glenwood came back and said, your adder is going to be 3 cents a kilowatt hour for these accounts, except for the Barclay Tower. You lowered your ICAP enough, we'll sell that to you at 2.5 cents. So the whole intent is to take these aggregated loads for all of their buildings and lower their ICAP value so that.
But then some buildings pay more than they should, and you're averaging the cost perhaps inappropriately across the portfolio that way, rather than each building paying what it should by its own load.
Well, it could be. It could be based upon that. What we have seen is there are ways to look at the rate structure to drive, if the retailer understands what you can do for them, they can save in their ICAP charge, because we can measure it. A lot of ICAP is estimated and not measured. So that's another advantage about putting the system in. We have the metering there that would say, hey, the ICAP was this. It's not what it was estimated as. Anything under a 500 kW peak probably has an estimated ICAP tag. Let me think about your other question. As far as in different districts, yes, if you were in a district that peaked from 11 to 3, you would pay more from 11 to 3. We would pay attention to the load in that building, but you would pay less at night when you really peaked, which would be most residential from 7 to 11 p.m. Any other questions? Okay, Josh, you want to just kind of give your perspective of what drove Glenwood to look at this?
Good. So we, as Doug said, we've been working together since 2010. And they came and met with us based on a recommendation from somebody that knew us. We've been participating in demand response programs since '99. And, you know, by the time 2009-10 rolled around, we were starting to get weary of the duration. You know, that's tailed off a little bit in the last couple of years, but the number of calls by the NISO and the duration of them was very significant, in particular after the blackout in the early 2000s. And we started to get a lot of tenant pushback because we asked tenants to participate as well as ourselves in our common load. And the tenants started to get a little more antsy about us shutting lighting off, shutting elevators off, you know, and not all of them, but 1 or 2 in each bank, and certain other amenity areas that we would actually close during the time that the demand response event was called for. But we kept doing it anyway, and, you know, and frankly, the revenue from that, I think, dwindled when the state got a little wise as to how the aggregators were figuring out your peak and your dip versus what, you know, the state thought it should be. So we agreed to buy 2 battery systems as a test, and we bought 2 systems we knew this wouldn't have a huge impact on our bills, but we wanted to see, the process for putting one in, siting it, constructing it, and operating it, and, in particular how the automatic function of it was handled. So that went remarkably smoothly. These first systems were a little different than the ones that I don't know if you showed a picture of it, but they're a little bit bigger. Each one was about the size of a minivan, maybe a little less. So we put them down in the garage in 2 locations, and the process went very smoothly. There was no real significant interest by the DOB or even Con Ed, except to make sure that we didn't have a safety factor, where if there was a power outage, this could feed back into the grid. They've since taken a lot more interest in what it is we were doing, but the way I verified that they worked was to use the metering devices that handle the data for our demand response and kind of cross-reference the output, the computer printout from the battery system against that. So we saw that when the system said it was injecting power, in effect, our meter slowed down. And this was handled automatically, and sometimes I would call and say, dump the power now, for example, during a demand response event, and we saw the 10 kW come off. So we ran those for about 6 or 8 months, and then started looking into putting in a larger system. And Doug mentioned Barclay Tower, which is down, it's about 2 blocks from the Freedom Tower. So we put in a 225 kW system there in 2012. We picked that building because it was just down in the hub of construction. It was difficult. It was crowded and tight. Power usage down there was a huge issue post 9/11, and with all the construction that has gone on down there, it's difficult to get anything done down there. And so we figured, let's try that. That's the hardest spot we can think of, and it's also a huge building. That process was monitored a lot more closely by Con Edison, by the Department of Buildings, by the fire department, and it went remarkably smooth for, I'm going to call them outsiders. They came in here from Spokane, Washington, and dealt with our agencies and with us as builders in the city, and they handled it very smoothly. So that system's been running since 2012, and that was where we really learned how one of these can affect the operation, energy-wise of a large structure. And it worked so well that it taught us that we don't just have, one of the slides showed a kind of a statewide peak, and a lot of people might think that, well, maybe your building peak is more or less similar to that, but it really isn't. The building peaks many times during the day. In fact, dozens upon dozens. So there's savings that can be driven there without chopping down that whole big mountain. And to the point of commercial buildings, by the way, that the commercial buildings ramp up kind of linearly, stays flat, and then they go down. So this is the opposite in a residential building, where you have a different kind of movement of people and usage of power. So we found that small things that go on in the building during the course of the day really could create peak that was significant enough to be dealt with by injecting power from the system. So to handle that, there's no person that's going to sit and control that. That needs to be done by software. So that's exactly what the system really is based on. We found that we've saved, and that was a big system to put in. We worked with Con Ed, we worked with the Department of Buildings to get the okay. We also worked with Con Ed and others to try and get incentives because it was costly. The business case for that system was, I think, 5 or 6 year payback. And we wound up doing that as a direct investment. There's no other incentive programs. There's no NYSERDA. There's no Con Ed. Obviously we would use it to accomplish demand response more effectively than the manual system that we have in place to do that.
And to reward us, Con Ed awarded us with standby rates.
Con Ed,
we thought it was going to kill us.
We were nervous. We were nervous about the standby rate because we didn't consider ourselves a facility with a generator, but a battery really is a generator. It just provides power differently than an engine or fuel cell. So that has been running consistently since 2012 and saving us 15%, plus or minus. I think that's about $700,000 common charge electric bill. That's a good saving. and after operating for a few years consistently with those savings, we decided to purchase a megawatt, spread out over 10 systems. We are completing the last of those as we speak, and some of those have been in operation for the last year and a half. And we're actually seeing better performance now. Doug kind of highlighted one, Paramount Tower. The savings is between, I think, 17 and 19% for the year there. And based on the DMP2, it looks like that's going to improve. Just a quick note on, the fact that the incentive will be available from DMP2, and the requirement will not be to inject power every single day during the summer, as we had been doing before, to me signals that they're planning on calling some more events than they've been calling. That's what got us to want to do something different than just demand response in the first place when those events started kind of becoming plentiful. And like I said, in the last couple of years, I think there's one or two. However, they were for 6 hours with a 4-hour mandatory, and that's still a big impact on a building that's occupied at the time. So I think that's going to be a significant thing. We're going to proceed with another 10 projects after that, and that was before I even heard about the DMP2. So I'm anticipating we can drive, a minimum 15% savings on our Con Ed, on our electric charges, and probably more.
And the last big wave was July in 2013, right? We had 5 days in a row where they called DER events. Started on Monday, ended on Friday. That Friday the 19th of July, was where the system peak happened that year. But last summer, if you guys remember, we had that heat wave in July that started on a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. We hit a new energy peak usage on Saturday. If that had been shifted and started like on Monday and been through the work week, which would have been Thursday then, we probably would have hit a new system peak in the city. So it's not that these peaks, we had 2 pretty mild summers before last summer. Last summer we set this new energy usage peak. Had that been on a weekday, we would have set a new system peak.
Just a couple more points. There's definitely peaks being set, and maybe that chart that showed the different areas of the city, everyone might have thought previously, well, there's the business district, and then there's every other district that's more or less residential, but there was a lot of different zones where the peaks are at widely different hours. Before we put in our first large system downtown, we were, I'm going to say approached, but we had Con Ed come in to one of our buildings and basically tell us, this was on the Upper East Side, vintage 1990, basically tell us that we are in a hot spot, that there's congestion in the way the transformers are laid out in that little small 1 or 2 block area, and that we basically had no choice but to put in another complete electric service to our building, or they would bill us for the cost of the new transformer and work in the neighborhood to the tune of $1.5 million. So, our building hadn't been doing anything differently. It was drawing whatever power it was designed to draw. Nothing unusual was going on there. We didn't have any new tenancy, and all of a sudden we were faced with bringing in a new set of power. This was as we were gearing up with, demand energy for the larger system. So that, after we pretty much had the job bid out and were ready to start, Con Ed changed their mind and found another way to route power down that street, else to a different transformer, and they told us we were off the hook. So more of that, in all likelihood, is on its way. At about that time, we kind of recognized that we're part of the problem. We put up, I think, 9 buildings since 2004. These newer buildings, as efficient as they are in the last 4 were our LEED certified buildings. They just use more power than their counterparts, even of the same size building. Despite efforts to make them as efficient as possible, they just have more things that are drawing power. So we recognized that we were kind of contributing to the overall problem, and not seeing too much of a way out in the long term if different things didn't start happening in the city. And then to hear things about the closure of Indian Point and other assets that are upstate, I think, which I don't know if they worked out some things with Entergy. There's another plant upstate that may close. Indian Point's 2 gigawatts, and that's feeding us right here. So there's problems on the way. There's more demand response on the way, and I think a lot of us probably have experienced that since the inception of those programs. This storing the power made total sense to me and to the others at Glenwood once we realized, we do better handling things that we deal with when there's an inventory of it. Certain things we don't like to have a big inventory of, but, just being at the mercy of the perfect supply and demand, instantaneous system like that where it's worse than that. There's no supply of it. It's instantaneously generated and sent out. I can't personally think of a more difficult type of a system to operate, and as the city grows, which you can't look too far out the window and not see a major structure under construction, as that continues, just the notion of a 100-year-old or the 1950s business plan of build infrastructure and feed it into the city, that's just not sustainable. So we recognize that we're contributing to that by building new buildings, and as I said, new ones just use an immense amount of power. So we're happy to figure out that this storage really is one answer, among others. Of course, we've done upgrades to lighting. We're through the second round, like a lot of people probably have been, from compact fluorescents. Now we're on to LEDs, machinery upgrades and all kinds of other things that the state will like us to do. But this has had the most impact, and the fact that it can drive savings for us at the same time and have a payback. Right now, a 100 kW system is a turnkey system for $450,000. That's before the NYSERDA incentive, which looks like it's going to be about $150,000 out of that. That's under a 4-year payback. I think that's about a 3-year payback, maybe even less, because we can just figure in depreciation. We can figure in the DMP2, which looks very significant. This just makes business sense. Besides the fact that it is a method of dealing with congested infrastructure, it makes sense business-wise, and that's our experience 4.5 years running. So that's
Great.
Basically, in a nutshell. I don't know if there's any questions on what I mentioned. Yeah.
The system you just described, what size of building would be the minimum threshold for that? Like if it's
It varies, right?
Probably about a 250 kW peak for a 100 kW system.
Okay, and like in residential terms, how many units is that roughly?
Well,
Big order of magnitude.
if it's master metered, that's probably somewhere between 150 and 250 apartments. But we have smaller systems. We can do smaller systems for those sort of buildings, but that's great. Not quite as good, just due to the fact that the installation cost is very similar, and it doesn't drive as much savings, and that's a great segue into what we're going to talk about.
Perfect segue. Are there any more questions before we?
I have a question for Doug. Have you ever used the battery storage as solar?
We're building one up in a property that Josh has up in Riverdale. And it's very interesting because there we put about 100 kW of solar on the roof, and we can fundamentally, our modeling shows that we can almost flatline that building from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. So that's in construction right now. It'll be operational this summer. We're doing the same out at Marcus Garvey, where we've got solar, a fuel cell, and storage, and that'll be operational in April.
Doug, I have another question. These energy storage systems, are they ever used for backup power as well, blackout?
Yep, and so in the Marcus Garvey project, that's set up so that we'll be able to power the operational center, the main office, and the security center in there. In some of the Glenwood buildings, we can manually throw some switches and drive some operations. To go in and retrofit some of the critical power circuits, when we looked at the Barclay Tower, it's about $200,000 of work electrically to change that out. But what's nice about new buildings that are being built there, the new code requires that critical circuits are already supported, and we would tie into those points and be able to do that more cost effectively. You can do it for resiliency. It's just the cost of getting the critical circuits switched over to a panel that makes sense.
That's great, thank you. And is it all lead acid, the technology?
These, that are in buildings are, lead acid. The stuff we're building where we can go outdoors is lithium. And, we just got approval on that. I think we'll get the fire department to approve lithium indoors, probably over the year.
Last question, lifetime, is there a number of cycles or lifetime to the battery?
These,
Would they require?
lead acids require that we swap out after about 5 years, and then lithium is a 10-year. And, they're both about the same cost, so you can argue that lead acid's a little more expensive than lithium, but we think in 5 years, the cost of battery technology will be a lot cheaper as well. Compared to when we started this, lithium is running about $3.50 a kilowatt hour. When we started this, when we put the first system in Berkeley Tower, it was $750 a kilowatt hour.
When they swap out these batteries, can they recycle them? I know the lead acid they can, but lithium as well.
Yeah, the lithium guys are working on a whole recycling process on that. So it's not as easy as lead, but lead's one of the most highly recycled products in the world.
Have you looked at how thermal storage could be used to respond to the DR?
Thermal storage is used all the time. A lot of ice storage here in the city. CalMac has a big installation, Rockefeller Center. The issue there is it's really just handling air conditioning load, which is what drives the peak. But the thing to remember about battery storage is as we get more and more renewables like solar and intermittent resources out there, to be able to create load when it's excess or whatever, or to be able to generate when it's rainy or cloudy, gives you a little more operational flexibility than thermal storage. But thermal storage has been used for quite some time, and there's incentives for it as well.
Great. Any other questions? Perfect. So yeah, that was a great segue into what we're going to touch upon. So I'm Dave Berger with Stephen Winter Associates. I think most of you know who we are and what we do, but we're a building science firm, sort of energy consultants. And this is Chris Lyle. He did a lot of this work as well. So we had a client come to us, I think it was back in 2012 or 13. We were doing an energy audit on their property, and separately they had gotten approached by an energy storage company to put batteries in their building. And they didn't really know what to make of it. They said, you guys are sort of the experts on efficiency and energy. You take a look at it and tell us what you think. We were skeptical, I think, at best when we first saw it, because I think, like most people, there wasn't a lot of data on load profiles of multifamily buildings, particularly under 500 kilowatts peak, which is a large portion of the buildings here in New York City. The big master meters are probably over 500. Those have interval meters, and so there you've got some good data on, but sort of the mid to larger size buildings, there just wasn't a whole lot of data on. And I think ourselves, like a lot of people, thought that the load curve sort of, was low overnight, sort of ramps up in the morning, and then peaks in the evening, and was sort of this S curve. And I think most people assumed it was the same or very similar for most buildings. And we started to dig a little deeper and noticed that the load curve maybe varies more than people think and maybe isn't as homogeneous as people think. And so we approached NYSERDA, submitted a proposal to do some research on energy storage in multifamily buildings and how do you screen for it if you've got a large portfolio and you don't have access to interval meter data, and then how do you sort of size these systems. So that's sort of what got us all going on it. So we're sort of going to take you through what our research, how we went about collecting data, results, and ideally, I think why you're all here is how do you identify buildings in your portfolio where it makes sense and size it appropriately. So, like I was saying, in order to accurately accurately size or to have certainty in an energy storage system, you ideally want 15-minute interval data, because that's going to show you what your building's using sort of in real time, or as close to real time as you're going to get here in New York.
And the challenge in Con Ed's territory is there's 6,000 interval meters for a total of 3.3 million meters, so
Yep.
it's not a lot of information.
Yep. So exactly, this data just isn't available for multifamily buildings. Like I was saying, there was sort of the perception out there that multifamily buildings sort of all have the same load profile, and so there was just, I think, some people dismissing it offhand that it wasn't a viable segment. So we wanted to identify a way to determine if your building's a good candidate without having this 15-minute interval data. And we had some hypotheses about building systems, building height, some of the mechanical equipment. So that's what we sort of dove into and started to look at. So I want to touch upon, and it's sort of been brought up, but this idea of peakiness, or a term that's often used is load factor, which is a ratio of sort of your peak load to your average load. And high load factors indicate that your building profile is sort of constant, or a load factor of 1 would just be a straight line across. A very low load factor of 0.1 would be something that was low. It had one very brief spike, and then it went back down. This concept was sort of used, or people thought that, okay, buildings with a low load factor would be great for energy storage because it means that they're peaky, and buildings with a high load factor would be bad because they're a flat curve. And in some cases that's true, but we started to realize that you can have an instance sort of with this first graph over here where it looks relatively flat, but you've got these few little blips there. So I forget what it is. This, if you actually calculate it, the load factor is about 0.8. But you have substantial room to drive energy savings because you can just sort of clip these little peaks, and you've done a fair bit to curtail your demand charge with not a whole lot of energy storage. But if you're just looking at the load factor, I think this building would be dismissed pretty quickly. On the other hand, something like here, which is actually pretty typical of a commercial building where you overnight, low load, people come in the morning, turn on all the lights and HVAC, it jumps up, stays like that until 6 or 7 at night, and then drops back down to that low load. Here, this load factor is something on the order of 0.5. So if you're just looking at load factor and you don't have the load profiles, you'd say, oh, that's probably a good opportunity to do some peak shaving. In reality, there's not much there because you're going to have to shave from 7 in the morning until 6 or 7 at night. So we realized that it was load factor wasn't the right metric to be using, and it was more peakiness. So how and where your peaks are occurring and the magnitude of them in relation to your load. Unfortunately, that's a bit harder to quantify, and we're still sort of working on that. I can't give you a great, I wish it was an equation, because we're engineers and we like that. Unfortunately, it can't be reduced to that, or at least we haven't been able to. So, yeah, how did we go about doing this? We wanted to take metrics that were sort of easily available, because you don't have interval meter data. What do you have at hand? What can you get from your monthly billing data? So looking at your monthly peak, we were going to use load factor because we wanted to see if it was an indicator or not, and how it matched up. And then some building characteristics, so square footage, number of floors, mechanical systems were something that we were interested in. Does it have cooling, heating? How is the heating provided? How is the cooling provided? And then what rates you're currently on, and what rates are available to move to, as well as, there was something else. That may have been it. we take these and boil them down into something that you can screen for. So what we did was we found 10 buildings that we thought were potential candidates, or that were multifamily buildings that represented some of these characteristics that we were interested in looking at. We went out, and a good portion of the grant paid for having interval meters installed in these buildings, because we said the first thing we need is actual data. We're relying on sort of anecdotal evidence, or what people think the load profile looks like. Let's actually collect some and analyze them. So we put meters in. We collected anywhere from, I think one building we had like 3 months of data, most had 6 months, and then up to a year plus of data. So it was good representative data of sort of both daily variation but also seasonal variation. And then we analyzed this. Actually, Doug and his team at Demand Energy assisted in this and did a fantastic job looking at the economics of it under various rate structures and also incentive structures. So like Doug was saying, and I think Chris will get into it a bit later, but the DMP program had an incentive for energy storage. They also had one for demand response enablement, which you can make the argument that putting these batteries in allow you to do demand response. And the requirements for that were that you just had to discharge the battery during a demand response event and not Monday through Friday from 2 to 6. So the incentive was less, but it also provided greater flexibility in your operation and allowed you to peak shave sort of on non-DR days. So we looked at a whole combination of system size, rate structure, incentive structure, and what made the most sense.
Yeah, so getting a bit more into the analysis, after we had collected all of the interval data, before we did anything else, we kind of just started looking at it, looking at what the shapes look like. And this is kind of just a representative sample of what a typical load profile might look like. Along the bottom here, you've got, so each kind of column on here represents a different day throughout the year, and then across, it's the same hour every day. So you can see here in winter, you've got lower loads, and then in the summer, you've got higher loads, all because you've got these big cooling towers coming on. Everybody's using their AC in the summer. So we kind of just started looking at this, trying to figure out, again, maybe what kind of factors we can pull out of all of this data to try and correlate it with the financial models that Demand Energy provided with us, to us. And then, again, this is kind of just a month slice out of that previous picture, looking at daily load profiles. And so this is July. This is, and each line represents a different day. That big orange peak up there is going to be the monthly peak for that building. And under a rate 1, that's what you're going to get charged on for that entire month. Under the standby rate, you're going to get charged each one of these days for whatever demand you've used that day. So instead of getting charged at the end of the month for 220 each day, you're going to get 220 or even 180, depending on what you're using throughout the month. So after we started looking at all this, we took the financial numbers that Doug had provided to us, looked at what Dave talked about, monthly demand, monthly peak demand, load factor, square footage, building height.
The other one was what's on the meter. So is it just common area load, or is it master meter, the entire building, common area and apartment?
And out of analyzing all of those, the only one that really seemed to stand out, correlated with financial performance, is the peak load for that building, the monthly peak load. So out of the entire year, the higher peak that building has, the more value you're going to be able to get out of an energy storage system. And specifically, we also found that of the peak loads, if you take all 12 out of that year and take the smallest peak, typically in the winter, January, February, you take that is the one that is most correlated with financial performance. So the higher your peak load is when it's the smallest, if that makes sense, the more you're going to be able to drive savings. Essentially just saying the more load you have, the more savings you can get out of the storage system. And that's really the meat of what came out of this research, that's how you screen for buildings for energy storage, just bigger loads, essentially. And we found that having the energy storage system tied into the common area only, that meter that takes care of the common area loads, helps drive the savings more because you get more fluctuations throughout. If you have a master metered building, you're kind of smoothing out all of those peaks. Everybody coming home and leaving at different times kind of smooths out those peaks. People turning on their air conditioners at different times. But if you have just that common area load, it tends to be more peaky with stuff not being smoothed out. So that was kind of the first part of this. It helps. It's best that you have a building that has a direct meter for the common area load. The smallest monthly peak demand on that meter for the common area load is at least 100 kilowatts. And again, the larger that is, it seems that you're going to be able to get more savings.
So that's typically the winter peak.
Correct, yeah, that's it.
Which makes a lot of sense because this town's driven in the summer by air conditioning load, and winter peaking would be more systematic loads, pumps, air handlers, elevators, those sort of things.
Right, essentially you're able to get value out of the battery system throughout the year rather than just over the summer. And again, we found that looking at all of the different rates for each of these buildings, the best one in every case was the standby rate, allowing you to have that daily as-used demand charge. So that you're not slapped with the charge for the day that you use the most electricity in any given month. And the last one, kind of an obvious point, is that you need to be able to have an appropriate location to house the system. But I think they've been fairly flexible in where you actually can house the system. This is kind of just sort of decision-making flow chart that sums up what I was just talking about. I think that's the gist of everything.
On the color chart that you had for Backaways, which I thought was very interesting.
This one?
That one, yeah. Real low use is not what I would consider deepest winter, is from November to January, which is typically a low heating period before you're hitting the deep winter.
So
it's kind of without air conditioning, but before you're hitting the main heating.
right, and I think specifically for this building, this is a water source heat pump building, and so in the shoulder seasons, you're probably not going to be running your pumps to circulate the water throughout the system in the shoulder season when not everybody has the heat or the air conditioning on. So I think specifically for this building, that's why you have the lowest in the fall area. Yeah, correct.
You should print that out and put it in the lobby of the building.
Yeah.
Actually, that's pretty cool.
Art.
It is hard.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. This is fascinating because the thing I'm curious about is switching to the day-ahead rate. Is that something, for your analysis, would that have delivered savings to these buildings regardless of whether they adopted storage, or is it only in the scenario where they have distributed storage?
Day-ahead index rate for supply will save you money. And the reason being is, if you buy a flat rate from a retailer, they have to build in the hedge of the volatility. So they'll build that hedge into the flat if you're willing to take the risk of the volatility, they'll build a fixed adder in there, so they have a fixed margin that they get, and that's comfortable for them. You're willing to take the hedge, but what you miss in that is that, if they have to be at risk, they're gonna price that flat rate low. So what we have seen, and we're in our like 5th year with Josh on running on index rates, index has always beat flat rates year on year.
There's small anomalies to that, but that's been our history as well, for electricity, gas, and oil.
Yeah.
Market rates are always, over the long term, safe over flat rates.
Yeah.
That margin, the rate may vary up and down, but you're buying to start with a premium with flat rate.
You bet.
Right.
Right.
Paying someone to take risk.
What a lot of people tell us is they like budget certainty, so they want a flat rate because they can forecast it and be on budget.
Certain to pay more.
And
I think the other interesting point is, what we found was that the standby rate made the most sense, or was the most economical. What Doug's proposing here in his rate design is essentially, so the standby rate takes, your traditional rate, rate 1, is just your billed for your highest demand, whatever that 30-minute period was over the month, for the entire month. The standby rate charges you 21 times, roughly, or 20 times, because you're charged Monday through Friday for the month. So each day you have a demand charge. What Doug is proposing is sort of an even more granular, you're charged for your demand, not just every Monday through Friday, but ideally he wanted hourly, but kind of said, well, let's just go with block pricing. So it's further breaking it down, and so it's a natural evolution to what we were finding here, in that the more granularity you have in pricing, sort of the better for the building and the more savings that you can drive.
if you can get your supply on hourly and then your delivery on hourly, I think that's where we're all headed eventually. And that does the right thing. It says, look, you will pay the marginal price and what it costs to deliver electricity to that section of town. And that's a fair assessment. I think that's, for people that are willing to participate in that sort of a market, I think, there's benefits to be had out there. Regulators love to say, well, we can't affect everybody, somebody may not be able to manage through that. And we're not saying that this is a mandatory, just make it voluntary. If you're willing to move forward and apply that, it's the same with index rates. You don't have to move to an index rate, you can. So we're just trying to get people comfortable with that whole concept that if you're willing to participate when it has marginal costs, then there are benefits that you can manage through those high cost periods.
Other questions?
Can you go back to a flow chart?
Sure.
You mentioned the FDNY approval within each buildings coming down the pike. Are there other regulatory barriers or legal barriers that you're encountering?
The building department has a series of things that they go through and look at, but fundamentally, the way that we'll cite a project is we start with the fire department, because the fire department looks at kind of 3 elements. First of all, just the sprinkler system, the ventilation system, and then access if they had to come in and fight the fire. And from that, then once we have that negotiated with the fire department on the location, then from the building department perspective, we look at structural. We'll do a structural analysis. We'll do the ventilation calculations, make sure we have the right air movement. And most buildings have the right air movement. We don't have to put anything additionally in. If we're going to close a room, we have to just make sure we have ventilation in and out of the room. And then we look at sprinkler systems just from a PE design to say that sprinkler is going to deliver what it needs. And if it's outside, maybe a zoning. Is it within the zoning requirements? So occasionally we'll run into something goofy that we ran into this out in Marcus Garvey, where the obvious place, the fire department wanted to put it in this one area that would have been really good, but it violated the zoning rule that said you couldn't have equipment within a 30-foot offset of the back lot line, which was kind of dumb, because if it was a piece of air conditioning equipment, the zoning exceptions allow for that. And the guy in the zoning department told me, well, your only problem is on the list, it doesn't say battery storage. If it said battery storage, we can put it there. So those are some of the, uniquenesses that we're running into, just that it's so new that we'll get there eventually. Mark?
I think the big one is that it's just not, even though we have 4.5 years of data, which hasn't really fluctuated except to become better as the software operates the system more efficiently, and we've driven better savings. I think people are just not comfortable with the track record in terms of if I invest $450,000 or $300,000, when will I get my money back? And to say, okay, give me a report, let the computer give me a report and show me what I've saved. Sometimes that just doesn't equate for people, because how do they know? The rate may have gone up and down, and it's never just A and B, black and white, with analysis like that. But to look at, my quarterly reports from our internal accounting department and the controller, and year after year to see what happens at buildings where I don't have a storage system, but I'm using similar rate structures, and then to compare it to the other ones, including when, rates went up at certain points, and then to see that building remain flat, in effect, is a comfort level for us. We just gave a PO for our second 10 systems. We're going to have about 2.25 megawatts aggregated when we're finished, plus the solar. It's a big project. It's not just, okay, I'm going to do a lighting upgrade, I'm going to do a boiler. It's not, people don't look at it as a kind of a better existing system being replaced, or a newfangled boiler put in, or HVAC system to replace one that was there that they knew they needed. This is like adding something to the building that was never there, and it's going to take up space as well. Space that maybe was leased out to 2 parking spaces or to building storage for materials, and something that is going to be lost for the duration. So we figured that in, and I think people are just not comfortable with that. I haven't walked through a lot of buildings where I haven't seen, I'm not talking just about Glenwood buildings, but others, where there's a space that's just underutilized for whatever reason. It's part of a garage or a basement it just doesn't lend itself to being used for typical things that are done in the building or parking, and there's very often sections like that in garages. And the flexibility of these cabinets being able to be located along walls, for example, they're only about 18 inches in depth. For us, made that less of a frog to swallow in terms of giving up space. So I think there's just not enough track record for owners to plunk down that kind of change. The track record's there. I've attended a lot of meetings. I've spoken at conferences across the country about this, and at first it seemed like everyone was just waiting for lithium-ion batteries to come online because, they're smaller, they're a little more forgiving, etc. They'll get there, and then they'll probably need to see track record with those. So I think as some people start to realize that we need a method, among others, to deal with the issue of congested grid in the city, the fact that that's just going to keep getting worse despite efforts to become more efficient. Not that there'll be no choice, but this will be a viable option compared to others that may be just as costly. It'll take time.
Are there any owners or property managers out there that have thoughts as to reservations, fears for putting such a system in your own buildings? operations and maintenance, who's taking care of it?
Yeah, we take care of that. It's all automatic as far as it lets us know if, we've got a problem. So like, if we have a batteries fail, they short out or whatever, and it just tells us on the system, hey, we've got a bad battery, we'll just plan the swap out and we'll go in and take care of that. We do that automatically as part of our agreement for Glenn. They don't really have to do anything, annually. Well, quarterly there's a checklist that we go through and we look at all electrical connections, do a quick thermal scan, kind of shows if there's any problems there, but they really don't require that much maintenance.
There was a certificate of fitness that was developed by the fire department after they gave approval for our project, and the superintendent at each of our locations had to go and get that certificate.
Yep.
Have you implemented more models and storage systems in your project?
Yeah, CHP. We've done actually, quite a bit of work with, Stephen Winter Associates, looking at what's the best blend between CHP and storage. What we have seen, is a lot of times people have tried to size CHP for peak load reduction. CHP is better suited for matching to thermal load, and then it allows, as long as there's enough thermal load that it can run as base load, it's a fantastic resource. It works well if you can get through the permitting and the siting and everything you need there. And then, what's nice is that, and then you let the storage system manage the volatility in the load, and the blend between those two is a pretty powerful combination.
Have existing code in almost all of them by KW and depending on the building, my utilization of the electrical side is minimal.
Interesting.
We bid out several projects and never got it to pencil out because of that same issue. And, they were costly, and we just didn't know what to do with the power.
So it's nice with the battery, we can create load so that can run steady state, and then we can take that load and we can go manage the volatility in those graphs that we were showing where, and let just the CHP just run at base.
Follow-on question, also related to Solidan, but the Solidan guy is about financing model. You brought up kind of revenue and track record. Do you see that as, I don't know, we really focus on that. What's the latest on that offering and that market?
Well, what we've put together is a shared savings model because, a lot of folks look at PPA models come out of energy projects, right? With things that are going to deliver energy. It's hard to equate that from a power rating. We could put a demand reduction charge together. What we found is that, let's just take the blend and let's look at, we can calculate what the bill would be without the system versus what the bill is with the system, and then split on the share of savings. So right now the model works out well where if we'd split it 80-20 as far as we take 80% of the savings to pay for the system, building owner would get to keep 20% of the savings. And that's gotten people over the fear factor, I guess is a good way to put it. But what's really interesting is as soon as they get more and more comfortable with it, they want a clause to be able to buy that out. And so I think that's just helping get in the market comfortable with the technology. This town's had a couple of train wrecks with fuel cells and early day CHP where things didn't go that well, so I think there's a reluctance out there to just jump on the new platform and be confident in it, and that's the way to get through it.
What is your model for this? Is it a sale of the equipment with a maintenance agreement? Is it a leaseback transaction? Is the owner simply giving you space to operate it, and you're selling them power output? How do you structure your deal?
The 3-pass, direct purchase, contract to operate, okay? A shared savings model where we get it financed, and then we split with the owner what the shared savings are, right? And then,
End of contract, does it revert to the owner?
it can, that's typically more like a lease. In a shared savings model, the whole theory is, look, we're taking the risk, so with risk comes reward, so there's, and you're gonna finance that thing over a time period, so you make most of your money on the back end of the project. So if you wanna buy it out, whoever's financing it, or the developer is really losing out on what they would gain on the return, so it's a little more complex, but there are, groups out there that will lease these sort of, and a, you know, capital lease then gets into some of your own tax structure and business structure as well, so. The shared savings model, we think, is a path to get people comfortable, and then, you can put the program together.
And, Doug, can you speak to the, beyond the concept of, intermittent load like elevator that, 2 hours a day, batteries,
Yeah, great question, Mark. We're looking at, Josh is building up on Riverdale. It's basically a building that looks a lot like that building right out the window over there. About 14 stories, what is it?
Two twin buildings of 200 apartments,
Yeah.
14 stories.
Yeah, and so, an older building, so there's a water pump, there's 2 elevators. The elevators are about 10 kW. So if you think about that, we're gonna put in this 100 kW storage system with 200 kilowatt hours of energy and 100 kW solar system. And so we could pretty much run the water pump, some common space lighting, and all the elevator loads basically for a 24-hour period. And if we've got any sort of feed, any bit of sun, we should be able to restore and replenish that during the operating days. So we're very interested to see how, what we can get away with. And it was interesting, I think, last summer, Con Ed called up, there was a DLRP event where I think on a Friday afternoon, they shut you guys down for 6 hours or something. So, and the super was just pointing out, hey, would you guys hurry up? Because, we went through that this summer, and it was a pain. And so, it does occur. And talk to other building owners that we'll see, a couple-hour outage out there, and when you gotta walk up 38 flights of stairs to go check mechanical equipment or deliver food and water, if you do that a couple of times, and you're pretty well convinced that the value of that is priceless. Typically, it's more the energy. It's a 400 kilowatt hour system, right? And so fundamentally, it takes us about 5 to 6 hours to refill that back up. You can see that in that profile if you go back, Chris, to the one profile up there that we can get away with this just due to the fact that we're not getting hit for the demand charges, but efficiencies, see that profile there, that's running about 100 kW. You can just see how it slopes out there. So it takes about 5 hours, basically from about midnight till 5 a.m.
You're right.
Any questions on the phone?
Yes. Does anyone on the call have any questions? No.
Well, I guess my questions are a little bit more technical. I'm curious about the round-trip efficiency of the energy storage system, if you see an increase in net energy consumption after these systems are installed. Then I'm really curious about this PV and storage project up in Riverdale. I'm just curious if that's an AC coupled system and how those 2 systems operate in tandem in a blackout event.
Great question. So lead acid, 80% round trip. So for every 5 kilowatt hours we put in, we get 4 back, okay? So you're absolutely right. That's why when we initially did these programs, Con Ed said to us, you know, we got a lot of money for energy efficiency, but since you're a net energy user, you don't qualify. And, you know, when you talk about optimizing the grid, using off-peak to supplement peak, that's really energy efficiency, but that's semantics. Lithium is 90% round-trip efficiency. In the solar system, we're doing AC coupled systems. We started out, the first ones we built, we actually built one in Tianjin, China, that was DC coupled, and you know, we thought the DC coupled was the way to go, but in reality, you use a charge controller, and it you can get limited by, if you're not using the battery and the solar is really producing, you can not be able to utilize the available solar. If it's AC coupled, we can always feed something in. If the battery's full, we can use it direct load. And it's just as easy. It's no more efficient. And we can load follow. We can monitor, because what we do is we just let it be AC coupled and affect the load in the building. Then our metering just watches the load of the building, and that's how we respond. So it's really easy to, it's probably easier to control AC coupled than DC coupled.
Thank you. And in the event of a blackout, those systems are operational?
Yeah, because the inverters that we use are full 4-quadrant inverters. They'll create the voltage that will supply the voltage that's needed in the solar inverter to be able to generate.
Thank you.
Other questions? Hey, thank you for attending. Thanks for your interest. We really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.